Hey, welcome everybody.
But
Friday,
people think, oh,
indoor afternoon elective, wide ski research. So happy to have John Seifert from Montana State University here. He offered to come join us and yeah, so he'll tell you more about the exciting research that he's doing, and maybe also it'd be awesome to see kind of the ongoing stuff that you've been doing in regards to research and how it helps us out. So I'll turn it over to John. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks, everyone. I would like to thank Dave for the invitation to speak today. These topics are really pretty near and dear to my heart, and I'm extremely passionate about skiing and skiing research. I actually grew up in a ski family when I was a little kid. I still remember the days that Mom and Dad would load us all into the back end of the Chevy station wagon and out to little rope toe hill outside our town, and we'd ski 2, 3, 4 days a week. And it instilled in me just this love of being outside. Consequently, my wife and I have passed this on to our kids, and just recently now our grandchildren. We have our grandchildren on the snow now. And so I kind of seen the transformation of the ski industry really over the past 55 years. It's really been pretty exciting and quite interesting. And I think over the last maybe 20 years, now granted I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the ski industry 30 or 40 years ago. I just went out to ski and have fun. But now that I'm into ski research and been in there for about 30 years, I've really seen these changes, and I'm the kind of person that I want to know why. How does this work? Why does it work this way? Can we improve it? So forth. And that's kind of where I want to start today. And, you know, we deal with skiing fatties. And my students are really, you know, it's really pretty interesting how we go through and looking at, I'll say wide skis, but everybody that I know calls them fatties. But there are a lot of questions out there, and when we go into ski research, regardless of the type of ski we're looking at, we have to address some parameters up here. Who are we dealing with as skiers? Are they beginners, intermediate, advanced skiers? Are they racers? Are they free riders? You know, so that would be your ability. How about skier age? Age has a tremendous impact how we respond mechanically and physiologically to our skis, to our boots, and so forth. We always hear the term, oh, I love skiing powder. Just love skiing powder. Well, what is powder? Can anyone define powder? You know, I was just down in Squaw Valley this last week, and you know, their powder is a lot different than Utah, which is a lot different from Colorado, which is different from Montana. What is it? How do we deal with it? The other thing we have to look at is right here. How do we quantify powder from a water content standpoint? All of these factors impact how we ski. They impact how our skis respond to those conditions. And that's kind of where I'd like to go today with this. However, we have to set some parameters. And you know, the devil really is in the details of what we're talking about when we get into discussions, especially when we talk about instrument. And it depends on so many factors. Okay. Well, if we take a look at, as a lot of you may know, wide skis were originally defined and produced for skiing off-piste. No question about that. You go back and look at this. Wide skis have been around since the 60s. Most people don't realize that. Kneisel, if any of you remember the Kneisel brand, Kneisel made a powder ski out of the late 1960s. It's really surprising, but certainly now in the last few years, they've really taken off. Well, in the North American market, and especially in the West, we see a huge percentage of ski sales being accounted for by wide skis. You take a look, just in 5 years, that growth has increased by over 50%, just in 5 years. Yes, ma'am?
How do you define wide?
Oh, you must have looked at my slides. Right there. Yeah, very good question. Very good question. We don't have a definition of what a wide ski is. If we take a look, some people define a wide ski as over 85 millimeters wide. This is under foot width now. Other people, 90 millimeters. We have some researchers out of Slovenia that have defined a wide ski as any ski under foot width greater than 100 millimeters. Well, in the literature, you take a look, and it's pretty common now that what we see in the research end, that a narrow ski is any ski under 80 millimeters, a mid-wide being 80 to 90, and anything above 90 millimeters underfoot being a wide ski. However, there are always howevers here, okay? You go back to August, this past August, in the Gear Guide from Ski Magazine, and they came out, oh boy, men's all mountain narrow skis, and this caught my eye right away. I said, I gotta check this out. And so I opened it up, and sure enough, they defined a narrow ski under 95 millimeters. Under 95 is a narrow ski. I'm going, wow, this is editorial malpractice, as I call it. Okay? But the other thing I thought that was really interesting, let me flash back. You may not be able to read the little caveat they have on the bottom, so I'll blow it up for you. And it says, from the front to the back, the soft to the firm, these are the only boards you need. You don't even have to check the snow report because these skis always deliver. And I thought right away, ooh, this is going to be good. All right?
Marketing.
And I thought, wow, this is something that I think is really pretty interesting because now we see a dramatic shift in terms of ski width and the impact not only on skiing, but maybe the mentality or the philosophy of skiing. When you think or you hear of a wide ski, what picture, not what terms, what picture comes to your mind? You picture some 30-year-old ripping Super G turns in a bowl or bouncing off of pillows in British Columbia. You know, that's what they always show. They don't show how many people actually ski on piste. That's not sexy, it's not groovy, it doesn't sell magazines, okay? You look at it and there are approximately what, maybe 60 million skier days, 55 to 60 million skier days in this country each year. The average skier skis about 8 days a year. You go, wow. That's pretty amazing. So, are there any things we can do with these skiers? Is there something we should be at least getting some good information on? I was in a ski shop a couple of years ago, last fall actually, a year ago fall. I walked in and first thing that caught my eye, I just had to show this picture. There's not a ski under 95 millimeters in the shop. Not one.
Where's
the shop?
Yeah.
No, you guys know it.
Greenwoods.
Bob Greenwoods, you bet. The little shop at the hill. Boise, I'm sorry, Bogus Basin. Yeah, not a single ski was under 94 millimeters. Absolutely shocked by it. Well, let's take a look. Let's get into the talk here a little bit more. You know, subjectively, we can observe this, that there are changes that take place in ski technique when we go from a narrow to a wide ski. For instance, we see these changes. We stand upright. We have straighter knees. We have straighter hips. We're not in that traditional ski position, that traditional athletic body position that we would normally see with a narrow ski. We also see that there's greater rotation that takes place in the body. My grad students affectionately know these as butt turns. Yeah, because you watch someone, and maybe I should jump down here. You know, here's your good ski position right here. But what you notice, and you can observe this with a lot of people, will stand upright, but when they turn, they start swinging their hips into it. They're much more upright, and therefore they actually get a lot more spinal rotation in their turns. So we know those are the things that take place. However, you know, this gets away from the technicality of instruments and measurements, but does a skier look good? If you recall a few years ago, I know it was in 32 degrees, there was a big article in there about the aspect of what is a good skier? What does a good skier look like? It's tough to define. We can see it. Oh, wow, he or she's a great skier. Look at that. But it's really hard to define. So we have to address skiing aesthetics. But we also, especially from an instruction standpoint, we have to know what are the goals of that skier, those skiers. Are they out there to really charge and carve up the mountain? Are they there just to get down the hill? So the goals really do impact how we respond. And then we also get to the science part of it. Is there a health or safety performance aspect that we need to address? So these are all factors that I think are really, really important. Before I actually get into the studies that I'm going to outline that have been done on wide ski, I'd like to just kind of give you a brief background on how wide skis work. So we have a narrow ski right here, wide ski over here. Narrow ski, we have a ground reaction force, GRF, that is transmitted up through the body. Now the ground reaction force is that force that pushes against your ski when you go into a turn. All right? The sharper the turn, the greater the velocity, the more ground reaction force you're going to have. If you make real long turns down the mountain, you're going to have a low ground reaction force. Right? Well, if we take a wide ski, now we add an additional lever arm, this piece right in there. That's a lever arm. And as you increase the lever arm, you do two things. You change the amount of force that has to be applied to the ski in order to make a turn. Very simple, okay? So, it has a negativity part that's associated with it. That negative part is you can't reach the same edge angles on a wide ski as you can with a narrow ski. Because I shouldn't say you can't. Bad choice of words. It's more difficult to reach edge angles on a wide ski compared to a narrow ski because you have to produce force to overcome this additional lever arm right here. Okay? And the only other way to do it is to get into soft snow. Okay? So, there we go. All right. So what we see is that as ground reaction force moves from midpoint of the ski to the edge, we increase that lateral lever arm. Okay? Well, what's wrong with that? Well, the problem that we have is that the knee moves into a valgus position. Valgus knees are nothing more than knock knees. Knees come together. Okay? I'll talk about that here in a little bit, a few more slides, why that is not a good thing to have, especially for knee health. So what would we do? What would we do to overcome this additional width, to get the ski up on edge, make your turns, and so forth? Well, one of the things that have been done is now, here's another aspect of malpractice. I can see this one coming. Take a look here. Ski shop added plates, add vertical binding plates. This skier that I just happened to catch, I apologize, it's not perfectly focused. I didn't see it until she was ready to get in the lift, or on the lift. But there's approximately 3 inches from the top sheet to the bottom of her boot. Now you've just taken a lateral lever arm, you've added in a vertical lever arm. Boy, you are going to get it up on edge. There's no question about that. However, what's going to be the first open joint or the first vulnerable joint that you come to in which these forces are transmitted? The knee joint stress, exactly. Exactly. So again, here's somebody, I don't know who it was, where they had their skis or what shop, but again, this is an issue because now you're just compounding the problem. Compounding the problem by that additional lever up. All right, so where I'm going to head today in my talk is we're going to look at 5 sets of data. These first 4 are all the scientific, pointy head kind of stuff. And then one that we have data that we're going to publish in 32 degrees dealing with skis and ski width and exam scores. All right. Ooh, yes. Okay, so the first one that was published, some friends out of Slovenia, Ljubljana, the University of Ljubljana, looked at the kinematics, and that's just how the knee joint moves throughout skiing. Very nice study. They used good skiers. They used their Slovenian demo team, as well as former racers. There we go. There we go. And they looked at 3 different ski widths. All right, very narrow, a slalom ski, a mid-width, and then definitely we see this wide ski at 110. Everyone completed standardized turns based on the radius of that individual ski. And you think, well, that should be a no-brainer, but you take a look at this, would it be fair, would it be good science if you set a slalom course and made someone ski wide skis through it? No, because that wide ski has what, maybe a 20, 21, 22 meter side cut, whereas now you're asking them to make 12-meter turns. Okay, so they set a course based on the radius of each ski. So the first thing, there we go. First thing I'd like to talk about what happens to the knee joint, extension versus flexion. And what we see here, we have flexion, starting here at the initiation part of the turn, and regardless of the ski, they extend coming into the first steering phase. All right? Then they moderate a little bit. They do go from more extension to less extension, get into the second steering phase back here, and then flexion on the crossover or the switch. All right? A couple things I think are really important to take a look at. First of all, you notice how right here, the wide ski is that light gray line right here, and how there's much greater extension with the wide ski compared to a narrow ski. Much greater. Yes, ma'am?
You're just talking about the outside leg, right?
Outside leg, correct. Outside leg. Mm-hmm. And so we're dealing with about 15 degrees different, or 15% difference. Okay? Roughly about 115 degrees extension. All right? So they're right about like this. All right? And then here you can see they're somewhere around 140 degrees, so much more upright. But what's really interesting to me is what happens in this part. Not only are they really becoming extended, but where do you find the greatest forces in a turn? What phase? Where on this curve would you expect to see the highest ground reaction forces?
S2, the bottom of the turn.
S2.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that S2. Right from about here, right kind of gave you the answer, right? Highest ground reaction force right in this area. Okay, put that in the memory banks, because I'm going to come back to that and explain why that's not the best situation to have.
I'm going to ask another dumb question. Could you
you
go
bet.
back one more time? So those dips in that line, the 2 downward dips where the red arrows are, that means that outside leg is the longest at those
Exactly.
points.
Yep.
And then it is the shortest at the far end, left and right.
Right here within the turn, and then here at the start, here at the end.
Okay. Well,
Those,
all right.
okay, that's where you see the greatest level of knee flexion. Okay? So why isn't that a good thing? Okay, now you get your physiology lecture. All right. Well, we have this thing called length tension curve of every muscle. And the way muscles work is that we have an optimal length that the contractile properties in the muscle are working efficiently. And that is just slightly above 90 degrees. So you look at your elbow, if I extend it a little bit, that's an optimal point to produce force. Well, what's happening, if we take a look at these peak forces, all right here, we see that occurring on a narrow ski at about 110 to 120 degree knee extension. But look what happens in two studies where their knee extension is with the wide ski, 138. They're out in this area. Now what's happened, that muscle is being stretched a little bit more. It's being extended, and you don't have the capacity to generate as much force as when you have more knee flexion up here. Again, this is normal operating area in this area. Keep in mind, with the narrow ski, we see knee flexions right around 120 degrees. That kind of gives you some perspective here. So the take-home point here is that as you extend your knees, we lose the ability to generate force in the muscle. Okay? How do we, oh, go ahead.
Is that in both directions, both flexion and
And
extension force?
yes.
Is that the same angle?
Exactly. Yep. Very much so. Very much so. We also lose it if I say go down into a deep squat. How come you can't produce as much force when you're in a deep squat? Because now the fibers can't shorten as much, and you still lose the ability to produce force. Okay? All right. So then we have one other thing, and I forgot I usually bring a knee along to show you, not a real knee, but a plastic knee or a plastic leg. The other thing that comes up with this, and I think is important to remember, and this from the same study, the Slovenian study, is that we have rotations of the knee. About 12 degrees for the narrow ski, 8 degrees for the wide ski. And what we see here, this is good for the narrow ski because why it's good? You have the femur, the thigh bone, right? Then you have the tibia down here, which is your shin. So what it's telling us right here with this narrow ski is that when you go into a turn, both the femur and the tibia rotate together. They're matched. However, with the wide ski, what we see is that tibia is rotating through the turn, as you would expect, all right? However, that femur isn't rotating as much. It's not rotating as much. So you get the tibia rotating like this, the femur only going part way. What's that going to do to the knee joint? It's going to go, oh yeah. We don't notice it right away for a couple of reasons that I'll get to here shortly. But there's a mismatching. But we can't jump right away and say, oh, this isn't good. We can't do that. We can't quite say that because there are defensive mechanisms that we do, for instance, standing up straight. That takes stress off the knee joint. But the downside of that, we can't produce as much muscle force. So there's kind of a, wow, it'd be great to have this, but there's also a negative.
Hey, John.
Oh, yeah.
So what is the angle in that graph then?
Is it the angle between the tibia and the femur?
Yeah. Yep, that's a knee joint rotation. That's right at the knee joint. Okay? So, exactly. So you can get, when you have approximately, it's about 90 to 130 degrees flexion or extension, so you're in a good ski position, you can actually rotate the knee joint quite a bit, 10 to 15 degrees. But when you start to stand up, you have less rotation that takes place. Okay, does that make sense?
That can take.
Well,
That can take place, yes.
yeah, that can take place, and that's why I'm wondering, because this graph says that wide skis produce less
Right.
angle between the lower leg and upper leg than the
No, it's a mismatching is what it's taking. So while we see tibial rotation at 12 degrees, here with the wide ski, we still have tibial rotation that takes place, but our femur is not going 12 degrees. Okay. I didn't want to show all the numbers because we can get lost in the numbers. But suffice to say, we have a mismatching between tibial and femoral rotation. Okay? So go back, I think most people have an idea about the ACL and why this is a tough situation to get into. Anecdotally, and there are no studies out there currently that show any issues with wide skis. So we have anecdotal information that after a day of skiing on the groomers, we do have people with sore knees, sore hips. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I'm not saying it's just the wide ski, but definitely there is an issue that takes place with a lot of different rotations taking place, counter rotations that take place within that turn, right? The other thing, as soon as you start getting into a counter rotation or a mismatching of rotations at the knee joint, what's going to happen? Well, the first thing that happens, if the tibia is rotating internally into the turn, the femur doesn't match it, we have two ligaments, ACL right in the interior portion of the knee. Then you have the medial collateral, which runs on the external side of the knee, on the inside of the knee here. And both of those start to get stretched. And anecdotally, again, this is one of the issues that comes up that we have to be aware of and see, well, how do we respond to that as a skier? Okay. So, I'll get to that here shortly. Again, just real quickly, real briefly, I talked about the conclusions to this study. We see definitely greater angles at the wide ski level compared to the narrow ski. We have greater relative external rotation for the wide skis, about 50% greater in the wide ski versus the narrow ski, all right? So like I said before, how do we minimize this? Well, we change our body stance, we stand upright, okay? But I think the number one factor that we've seen on the hill, we change our turn patterns, we change our turn characteristics. Now, if you take a narrow ski, and most people will arc, they'll make a symmetrical turn, right, with the narrow ski. However, with the wide ski, and we have confirmation, I'll show you here in another study, what they do, they don't turn into the fall line. How do they ski? They ski more parallel to the fall line, then they get to that final, the completion phase of the turn, and what do? They hook their skis. Yep. So they get this big impulse at the bottom of the turn. And we see that. So these factors put together help reduce, or hopefully reduce, knee stress that's incurred. All right, next study I'd like to go over real quickly. Does a wide ski influence muscle action? Again, this study, we used one skier. I think most of you have heard of Deb Armstrong. We used Deb, she was more than enthusiastic to help out. We used Deb simply for the fact we knew that, one, she's a good skier. Two, she was going to be extremely consistent from turn to turn to turn. We knew we were going to get good turns from her. So, you know, it was fun working with her for the afternoon on this project. So she skied two different skis. She skied a slalom ski, a slalom cut, 66 millimeters underfoot, and laughable now, but a 95, which we call the wide ski. All right, we had her ski consistent turns. What we did, unlike Zorko's study where they matched the ski to the gate set, we didn't do that. We opted to say, okay, we have a 12-meter ski, 12-meter radius ski, and we have a 20-meter ski. So we said, let's cut that in half. Let's go right in the middle. That way, we're not gonna bias either ski. So we took and we set our course, we set 2 courses, or 1 course, and we set that at 16 meters, 16 meter radius, right? Now, getting into the results, I think it's really amazing to see, when I went back to it earlier when I said how consistent she is, look at how consistent she is between free ski runs. We had her just take the skis, make free ski however you want. With both skis, that's what the free refers to, wide ski, narrow ski. And then we use brush gauges. Our sensors that we use to measure muscle activity run about $2,500 a piece. So we didn't want her bashing plastic going down the hill. That gets expensive, okay? But look how consistent she is. Average turn time, 1.272 seconds, 1.68 seconds. Extremely consistent.
And that's from initiation to completion?
That is, we use edge change.
Okay,
Crossover to crossover,
okay.
okay? Brush turns, the same thing. She's very consistent. 1.28, 1.27, 1.68, 1.72. So we knew we were getting consistent skiing. That's very atypical of skiers, believe it or not. Especially, certainly, beginner skiers, intermediates. Once we get into advanced skiing, then we start to see very consistent turns. But yeah, she's still really tight.
I got a question.
Oh, yeah.
It's interesting that our consistency became about double, or inconsistency between the two is so to say.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
And number one, the first thing we wanted to do was actually, all right, Deb, do you want to ski wide skis? When's the last time you skied wide skis? We went through the whole litany so we knew she was, you know, these were her skis. But we wanted to make sure she's on top of them. And yeah, no problem at all. But it is interesting that even with that consistency of time, the deviation, the variation
Right.
between treatments or between skis, very consistent, as you mentioned, very consistent. Well, and I have to say, we typically don't see this, that tight grouping of the turns like that. So nonetheless, we see faster turn times, regardless if we're in a course or she's in just free skiing. The other thing, look at the edge angle. Average, and this is average peak now. She's about 64 degrees. She likes to arc. Boy, I've never seen anything like that. That was impressive. Very good skiing. But nonetheless, she still had greater edge angle with the narrow ski compared to the wide ski. We go, where in the turn did this peak edge angle occur? Now, for most part, you would like to see that peak edge angle occurring somewhere right around the fall line. Now, because it's field work, we had to guess where she hit the fall line. On a course, it's pretty easy because you have standardized turns. But the other thing that, to me, is really fascinating, how consistent she is. 51% of her turn, that's where she hit peak edge angle when she was on a narrow ski. Down here in the brush course, real close to 50%. But take a look what happens here in the brush course for the wide ski. She reached peak edge angle roughly a third of the way into the turn. Why would that be? Why do you think that would happen? If you look at her free skiing, boy, her free skiing, she reached that peak. You were right close to the fall line. Right close to the fall line. But here, wow, that's way ahead of the fall line.
Trying to get the ski to hook up earlier so that it'll shake the turn.
Shake the turn, exactly, exactly. And I think it's really amazing, and this is something we've seen over and over again. When you look at wide ski, you see this edge change where that peak occurs right here. Then they ride kind of a plateau. They don't really change edge angle a whole lot. They just kind of ride it, and then we drop, and we have the end of the turn, where we get this very symmetrical peak within a narrow ski. Right? So when we have a flatter ski like that, one of the questions that came up, do we see more skidding? We call it chatter, but chatter, skidding, whatever. Does this help reduce knee joint torque? We can't address this factor, but we can actually, do we self-regulate forces? Do we regulate that force when we're into a turn? Do we want to regulate it so it doesn't get too high or too low? And the answer is most definitely yes. My group over in Salzburg, Peter Scheiber published this back about 5 years ago, where we skied skiers under flat condition, which was 14 degrees, a steep condition, 24, and then a race course at basically the same, at 23 degrees. They skied a narrow ski, 67 millimeter, that was a GS racing ski, and then a wide ski. And we chose a GS just simply for the fact it more closely mimicked what we saw in their own fat skis. And you notice, look at the average force within that turn. Very close, almost identical. Almost identical. So this gives us really good evidence to support the fact that, yes, we do in fact regulate the forces when we get into a turn. Now certainly sometimes we have pilot errors, but I get that. But overall, we do regulate that force quite closely. Well, we also looked at knee extension. We saw that during free skiing, on the wide ski, Deb had 15% greater knee extension compared to the wide ski. Wow. All right, this made us feel great because we are able to support Zorko's work of 14%. These two are really close together. Brush course, however, the way, I don't know if any of you have seen Deb ski, but Deb is a go-getter. She's a charger. And when she was in the course, all you have to do is set gates, and she's full on. It doesn't matter what you put on her boots. And we saw very similar values in knee extension between skis when she was in that course. But at the end, she said, wow, these skis stink. Yeah, you know, and so I thought, okay, we knew she had to work more. Well, from a muscle standpoint, we take a look at muscles. Now, here we have, oh, I didn't change this. That should be a narrow ski, wide ski, narrow ski. We looked at the gluteus maximus, extremely important muscle for movement, not only of the hip, but also of the pelvis. It's also a large external rotator of the femur. When the gluteus maximus contracts, it wants to turn the femur out. Okay? It also helps in hip extension. So when we want to stabilize our body position, it's going to want to make us stand more upright. Okay? Well, in order to get these, or to minimize the forces, we see a longer turn in order to minimize this. We saw that with Deb. Okay, now I know her turn time was slower, but her turn length was also longer. Her turn time was also longer. All right. The other thing, and here's something I think that we work with constantly with young racers. They're two-footed skiers. Okay, which if you're on the flat, not a big deal. You can ski two-footed. How many of you ever seen a ladder truck, a fire engine, going around the corner? Ever notice they have somebody sitting in the back steering? Why is that? To make the turn. When you're on a wide ski, if you stand on the inside ski, you can actually shorten the radius of that turn. So you become more two-footed. Okay? Problem with that is when the snow gets hard, or the pitch gets steeper. If you're skiing on 2 feet, what happens if you're standing on the inside ski? You bet. It won't take long and you're bouncing down the hill. Yeah, exactly. The other thing we looked at, muscle of the lower leg, peroneus longus. This is probably, I would say there are 2 muscles below the knee that are absolutely critical for skiing. One is the tibialis anterior, which is on the front part of the shin. The other is the peroneus longus, very small muscle that runs on the lateral, the outside part of the lower leg. The peroneus longus is an extremely important muscle for everting the foot. So if this is my right foot and I want to evert, turn my sole out, the primary muscle that's working to do that is the peroneus longus. And what happens here is that we see a much greater activity in the peroneus longus with the wide ski. It's working a lot harder to get the ski up on edge. Well, 2 years ago, with the back up to these earlier studies, and when I present this, people will say, well, who skis on groomers? About 95% of our skiing population. However, take a look, and I fully accept criticism of why would you want to test a wide ski on a groomer? They were originally made to be in the powder. So this last year at the International Congress on Science and Skiing over in Finland, I presented this data that we just finished this last season now on wide skis. And we took the skis, and instead of just being on a groomer, we put them in the powder. And it was pretty amazing. We took 5 expert skiers. They're really good skiers. 4 of these were former racers in one form or another. Another single expert level skier. 4 males and a female. All had tremendous experience, obviously, with narrow and wide skis. Their skis were 69 and 98 millimeters underfoot. Average slope, not a radical pitch by any means, 23 degrees. All runs were completed on the same run at Bridger Bowl. And I do have to give Randy Elliott and Bob Pettit from Bridger a huge shout because, man, they pulled out the red carpet for us on this one. They called me in the morning, guys in the office called me and said, John, we got a lot of snow. You may want to come up and do your work. As soon as they called me, I called Mountain Operations. They got in their cats, and what they did on the same run, they took 2 runs and groomed the middle part of the run, left the outside quarter untouched. So this way we could be on the same pitch hill with testing this, all right? Where they could ski on the groomer, then come around, ski in the powder.
Which one?
It's off of Powder Park.
Okay.
Powder Park Run, I think. I think. Help.
Or was it
It's
over?
that pitch that comes down right above Sunnyside.
Okay, yeah, Powder Park.
Powder Park, yeah. See, I bring help along. All right, so these are just the muscles that we measured certainly of the hip, rectus femoris, bicep femoris, hamstring, and quadricep muscles up front, vastus lateralis, big knee muscle. We use our motion sensors again. If anyone wants to donate, I'll give a selfless plug to donations to our lab. These things run, like I said, about $2,500 a piece. And luckily enough, we found one. We had a student lose one in the snow a couple years ago. And a week later, we found it, still intact. So, I was sweating. Well, we collected data, and it's really tough. It's like I said in the beginning of the talk today, that powder is always different. So it was really hard to get days that were similar so we could have similar testing days, similar snow conditions. And we came pretty darn close. I think this last year we got all kinds of snow, but we were always getting 4 to 8 inches. And that's a problem because 8 inches, you still ski on the bottom, whatever is underneath. So we waited to get up here 35 centimeters or 13 inches up here, 14 and a half. So, okay, now we knew we weren't going to be bottoming out. We had good water content, 4.5 up there, good cold smoke. This year, a little bit heavier, but not bad, 7% is still pretty nice snow. Well, we took a look, and I'll go through these. The first 2 bars, always on the left-hand side, will be the groomed run, the narrow ski on the groomer, wide ski on the groomer. Then the last two on the right, over here, these will be in the powder conditions. Okay? Narrow ski in the powder, wide ski in the powder. And you can see, relatively speaking, they're always kind of in that 30%, 35% range. And I go back, and as I was talking to one of the grad students who worked on the project, I said, something's wrong here. Because we always hear skiing wide skis in the powder is easy. It's easier than skiing narrow skis. We're just not seeing it. We're just not seeing what's happening here. These are very consistent results. So that's, you know, a hamstring muscle here. Rectus femoris is part of the quadricep. We look at the gluteus medius. Gluteus medius is probably the most important muscle for femoral rotation. When you go into a turn, you want that gluteus medius to fire so that femur rotates for you. Again, a little bit lower here in the powder for the wide ski, but again, pretty consistent for all these conditions. And we kept banging our heads, and finally, it was like, I can only be stupid for so long. And I thought, okay, here, let's take a look. You know what? We're going to break these turns into phases. Now, unlike the Slovenians, we use 3 phases. We divided each turn into 3 equal components. Okay? We divided the first third into the switch initiation, the steering phase, and then the completion phase. Again, these were all equal phases of a turn. Now is where we found the mother lode. When you take a look at this, the first thing to show you, you notice for almost every single muscle on the groomer, the wide ski had greater muscle activity. Here, over here, a little bit more here. The other thing to notice is take a look at the yellow bars, oops, right here, right there, and up here. In the third phase, these muscles are all highly active at the end of the turn on a wide ski. But compare that to the narrow ski. Just as what some of you had mentioned before, we should see that high muscle activity right in the middle of the turn. And that's what we do, right in these 2 phases. That's exactly what we expected to see in the narrow ski. But it goes a little bit backwards what we thought would happen with the wide ski, but then it makes sense when we got into the powder, and I'll explain that here in just a second, okay? The other thing that came up is look what happens in the powder, however. When they skied their narrow ski in the powder, we always see greater muscle activity in the narrow ski compared to the wide ski. All right, almost the exact opposite. This one's pretty similar. But in these 3 muscles, we always see more activity with the narrow ski. The other thing, look where peak muscle activity occurs, right where you would expect it, right at the steering and completion phase for the narrow ski. But notice now, look what happens in the wide ski. It drops down at the steering phase. For every single muscle, it drops down at that pink bar for the steering phase. So what this tells us is that, oh, now I understand why it's easier, if you will, to ski a wide ski in the powder. Because right when you would expect to see the highest ground reaction force, we're not seeing that in the wide ski under powder snow conditions. Secondly, when we look at these things and went back and looked at the video, these skiers did not ski the same turn between a narrow and a wide ski in the powder. The narrow ski, they still went like this. They were hooping and hollering because they were getting face shots. How do you get a face shot on a wide ski? I define anyone to get a powder face shot in the powder with a wide ski unless it's steep and really deep.
Right.
So how do you get a face shot in the powder? jam your skis at the end, the snow blows up, you ski through, yeah, powder shot. Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what we saw here under these conditions. Every single skier, bar none, they came in more parallel on the fall line, then they jammed their skis at the end of the turn, right here in the yellow bars. But then what would explain this high activity at the start of the turn for each and every muscle? If you think about it, as soon as they jam their skis, what do they have to do in order to bring their skis around? They got to apply more muscle force to bring the ski around and redirect it. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
But then from the other graph where you didn't separate into phases, it showed that although they're totally different turns and different techniques, the total amount of force that's being spent on those different types of turns is still overall the same.
Very similar. Very similar. Exactly. I won't say it's the same, but I'll say it's very
It's
similar.
difficult to find the distinction.
Yeah, it's very difficult to say, oh, look at this over the course of a whole turn. But again, when we get tired, think about how your turn shape changes. We tend to change not the crossover, not the completion. We change the steering phase because that's where we see the highest ground reaction force. Okay? Or we tend to ski across the hill. Okay. There we go. So what we see from this study is that over the turn cycle, like we just mentioned, very little difference between the skis. But when we start dividing out into the turn phases, that's where we see the narrow ski at the steering phase and at the completion phase, high muscle activity. For the wide ski, we see high phases or high activities at the first and third phase, or the crossover and completion, but very low activity at the steering phase. What we found as well, and I didn't put the data in here, but we also measured in a different part of the study, we used force insoles. We can put pressure insoles into a ski boot. We can look at how pressure changes throughout a turn. And we definitely see this. We definitely see that high pressure at the end of the turn drops off in the middle of the turn. It's very, very clear, very distinct. And as I mentioned before, we see the visual difference between the two skis, arcing versus adjacent. So then, that brought up the next question. And this starts getting into the application part for instructors and coaches. Grad student Heidi Nunakoven, we came down to Squaw Valley last year and did a study for her thesis on young racers. And part of my work is to look at not so much the objective data, but the subjective data. We wanted to look at perceptual characteristics in these young developing skiers. This isn't published. I'll be presenting it in Prague this summer here, coming up in a few months. But we had 13 U13 skiers, all right? They skied their own skis, 64 millimeter and a 98. And it shocked me. It shocked me. This is an adult width. None of them had a ski longer than 165 millimeters, or centimeters, sorry, 165. So proportionally, their skis are a lot different from what we have as adults, okay? So anyway, so those are the two ski widths we used. We set 2 courses. We wanted to get standardized turns. One course matched the slalom, one course matched their wide ski. We gave them a questionnaire after each of the courses, all right? All it was rank your confidence from 0 to 10 after each course, all right? 0 being no confidence, not aggressive, horrible line through the course. 10 being extremely confident, extremely aggressive. And the results were not surprising. They're not surprising. You take a look, here's a 10-meter course, all right, for confidence. We have the narrow ski in green, blue line or blue graph being the wide ski. Look at almost half the level of confidence with that wide ski is with the narrow, regardless what course they're on. They did not have the confidence going through the course. Their aggressiveness, we tell people you have to have aggressive feet when you're skiing. Here, they definitely didn't feel aggressive in their skiing. We go to their perceived line. Perceived line, we see the same thing. They thought they were faster. They thought they had a better line. They thought they had better entry into each turn. Well, consequently, that showed up. Here are the turn times, average turn times. All right? We're still seeing a significant slower turn with those wide skis. So what are the implications to this, the perceptual now? And I think this really strikes home with all of us as teachers, is that we have to be aware of the implication of skiing on wide ski from a perceptual standpoint. And you say, well, why is that such a big deal? Well, certainly we know the skis ski differently. Anyone who's ever been on wide, narrow skis, we know there's a difference. We feel that difference. But could this be representative of a feedback system that we have, an innate feedback system? Well, a little more digging, and we found this from studies, and this gets into complex activities, not coming out of ski data, but other complex physical activities, and that this, I think, is the critical line right here. The feeling of task completion with competence has been shown to increase motor learning sport skills, most likely by decreasing the level of inhibition and creating more effective movements. I think that's extremely, extremely powerful. When we're confident, we've all experienced times that we're confident with physical activities, times we're not. We perform better when we have that higher level of confidence. So this brings me to the last little bit. I think this is always an eye-opener to most people. We go back a few years, did this work with Ron Kipp. As I mentioned earlier, we were writing an article for 32 Degrees. And does ski width influence certification exam scores? So what we did, we took nearly 250 scores from level 2 and level 3 exams. All right? Here are the first group, 127 skiers going for their level 2. And there are two things that stand out. Certainly the obvious, as ski width here on the x-axis, score on the right. As ski width goes up, scores go down. Wow. It's really pretty amazing. And if you say, what's passing score for most, I think you score 3 or something. It varies. It varies, I'm sure, from region to region. But you notice, wow, what a relationship. This is a very strong relationship. The second thing that caught my eye, is this number right here. 50% of the variability in the score is accounted for only by ski width. Wow. People worry about their boot buckles. I would be worried about my ski width. Okay. Well, said, are we going to see the same thing for level 3s? You know, level 3s are good skiers, and they should be able to crush it. Almost the same exact result. Only nearly two-thirds of the variability of their exam score is accounted for by ski width. So if there's one factor people need to worry about in an exam, it definitely is their ski. Definitely is their ski. I know that's not the only one. I get that. However, you take a look at low-hanging fruit and what can I take care of, that is definitely the biggie.
Is this an overall score average for their entire?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Not for a specific task.
Not for a specific task, overall. Yep, average overall, okay? And you take a look at these, you know, they're fairly similar, 80 millimeters roughly for underfoot width. I think that's pretty amazing. So what do we find? Certainly, just a little bit of food for people to think about. As we increase ski width, we definitely see a reduction in scores, okay? Well, are there benefits? I hate to just sit and rip on skis or give that impression of ripping on a fat ski, but certainly, you give this ski to an intermediate, man, they can ski powered like they've never skied before. Yeah, and we can't discount that. I mean, we laugh about it, but yet we can't discount that perception that they have, okay? Well, you know, you take a look at this, and certainly, I think maybe there are possibilities. You take a look at the stability of a wide ski, no question, skiers feel more stable. Beginner skiers feel more stable on a wide ski. That's huge to get them started. The other thing that I actually have a grad student working on right now is for our older skiers. I think this is a huge part. One of the things, I turned in a grant to look at the effects of skiing over the course of the ski season on the elderly. And I wanted to track our older skiers throughout a full ski season and look at how their fitness components change. And so we collected some pilot data. Oh, yeah.
What's considered elderly?
1 year older than me.
And that age is?
Our skiers that we used in the pilot study, the average age was 66.
That's older. Those are babies.
Yeah. Yes,
Powder, do you mean untracked?
untracked, correct. We have to have untracked because once it starts getting tracked up, the issue that comes up, now your skis can start to bounce on you. You have changes in the ground reaction force. If you hit some place where a skier had just gone down. Yeah, so our studies have all been in untracked snow.
Kids.
Your first or second run.
Yeah.
Did you look at it, because you've got your last two bullets there.
Yep.
More stability for senior skier, increased knee stress.
Mhm.
Did you trade
We
that?
have to, it's an oxymoron.
Right, that's my question.
Yeah, yes, it is, all of it.
Because you've got a.
But what happens, you know, how many of you remember the GLM? Yeah, graduated, okay, yeah. Why can't we go the other way? Why can't we start them on a 90 or 95 and then gradually go down, I shouldn't say short, narrow, get it more narrow, okay? And by the time they're done, maybe they're on an 80 or a 75. Because we have to account for, I don't know where you're from, but out by us, you know, hey, old man, I like your skis. And I still ski at 67. You know, hey, old ski, retro boy. Yeah, I've heard it all. I hear it all, yeah. Well, my remark to them is I know how to ski. I don't need a fat ski. Ooh, that shuts them up pretty quick. But, you know, this is something, I want to go back with this grant application, is how do we keep our older skiers in the sport? Do we get more or new older skiers into the sport because of the changes in fitness capacity over the winter? I think this is a huge factor. I think it's extremely important. My parents skied, my mom and dad skied into their mid-80s, you know? And I think more that part was, well, we have coffee with the boys and the girls, you know? And they'd ski an hour, come in and have coffee. Well, God, Mom, Dad, you're drinking more coffee than you ski. Yeah, we'll get on with it. But, you know, I think it's important. The social as well as the physical aspect, extremely important. Well, I got the reviews back from NIH, and they said, well, we're not going to fund it. We're not even going to score it. because you're dealing with the high economic class of people. And I thought, oh, I guess they haven't been out to the slopes. I think if they're from Aspen, yeah, you could say that. Vail. But look, a lot of the mom and pop hills that you have around this country, I think, yeah, that's extremely important to hear that. Told me they didn't understand what the picture is. Yeah.
You know, and maybe you kind of answered this when you used the GLM analogy, but for beginners, the wide skis seem to be counter to the earlier point about skill acquisition.
Yes, exactly. But if you can get them on that ski for one day, and let's assume they come back, most lessons are what, 3 or 5 if you buy a package, something around that line? Okay. Yeah, if they come in, you get them on that ski so they're confident that they can stand up. Now the second time they come back, let's shorten it down from, say, a 90 or an 85. Let's go down to an 80. Then the third time they come in, let's go to a 75. Because let's face it, if you're in a raw with a raw beginner, that first day is hell on earth. Yeah.
It can be.
Can be.
But we also, you know, we do strive to get them able to use the edges to, you know, break and stop.
You bet.
The wide ski makes that harder.
But if you take a look, what kind of angle can they establish, the beginners establish? They're small to begin with. You know, I'm not saying this has to be, hey, you gotta go this route, but yeah, we need to at least talk about it and have it enter into the discussion. Yeah.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
When you do these, when these studies were done, you're talking about the width underfoot.
Yep.
Was there any measurement of the comparison of the side cut compared
Yes.
to these various widths?
Yes.
Because obviously if you have one with a big arc side cut versus a straight one, that's going to affect that.
We kept all of our skis, most of of our skis were all in that 20 to 22 meter radius.
So the
Yeah.
skis were consistent.
Yes, so those were consistent. One of the problems you run into with wide skis is when you take a look, now you have early, late rises, you have, you know, whatever else going on the ski. Okay, does that matter? Well, yeah, you take a 190 powder ski and all of a sudden you change the camber and you're skiing on a 140. If it's a groomer, you'll watch them come down the hill on a groomer and the tips are just going like this. All of a sudden you're on a 140. Effective. Yeah. No, but we do keep those consistent. We do keep those consistent. We have to also,
So,
Yeah.
I'm just discussion points.
Yeah.
More stability for senior skiers in powder?
we haven't looked at that, but that would be the assumption.
Okay.
That would be the
So
assumption.
you're saying that's for powder, not for,
Yeah, that's not true.
Yeah.
okay, one.
I think, I go back to, where do most people ski? What type of slope? It's a groomer. It is a groomer. And I would love to say we should start everybody on a 70. Ideally, from a mechanical or physiological perspective, that would be ideal. But yet, if you're taking a new skier, that stability issue is huge. One thing we just completed down in Denver, I don't know if any of you have heard of the Snowbond, the skiing carpets. We did work on a ski carpet. It was good from the standpoint of having a beginner skier get used to that movement pattern. For an intermediate and expert level skier, totally different muscle component. I think it was good from the standpoint metabolically, yeah, we can get our heart rate up and we can do this and get ready for the ski season, I get that. But from a muscle and a neurological component, no, they're different. But I think from a beginner standpoint, hey, if you can get that beginner to feel confident, comfortable on skis in that carpet, then get them out to the snow, boom, you're much, much further ahead.
So to that other one where we were looking at young racers, their level of confidence had to do with the fact that none of them were beginners.
Correct. They were little rippers.
We haven't seen any types of study or detail for
No, but we've.
the levels 1 through 3.
No,
You know,
no,
beginner
we haven't.
skiers may feel that same level of confidence that the racers felt on narrow skiers.
It very
Beginners
well
may feel that on
turn out.
wide ones instead.
Could very well turn out that way.
So at least we should look.
Yep,
He carries
yep,
with him.
yep.
He comes
To give you an idea, to do a study like this with the muscle sensors and that starts at about $8,000 to $10,000. So the ski industry really doesn't like to divvy out that kind of cash.
And that's 8 to 10 is,
An average
Does that-
vacation here was 40
That takes care of everything. All of our instrumentation, being on the hill, data collection, paying our subjects, whatever
how about
is.
paying with testers?
Yeah, things
Yeah,
like.
paying some.
Oh, that's what I mean, paying our sub, yeah.
But subject, you've got people doing monitoring, you pay them too?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
You just ask.
Grad students don't work for free. We give them a couple bucks. Hey, here's some PBRs and they're happy.
Yeah, carpet's an interesting comment, because we have one near our mountains. And to go over there as a skier and get on it, you gotta learn the tricks
Oh,
in order to facilitate, but to bring somebody, like you said, there and then bring them to our mountain, really had a positive effect.
I think there's some possibilities, and go back to what you brought up, how about the different level of skiers?
Yeah.
You know, yeah, I think that's important that we have to take a look at. That's why I put, what about class offerings? You know, how does that account for different skis, different abilities, obviously? Pedagogy, do we have to think about, you know, how many of you have had skiers show up, students show up, some show up in a 67, others show up in a 105. You know, it's not uncommon to see that.
Hey, John, I
Yeah.
have a follow-up question
Yeah.
on that last major bullet.
Mhm.
Did you monitor skiing on the groomed and what you're seeing in terms of muscle tension in the quads? Because one of the things I see a lot of wide skiers on our mountain doing is they're cruising along and they're sitting back, like during the
Yep.
kind of skiing you were talking about
Yep.
where the tips are flat.
Yep.
And they're like basically doing a wall sit for the whole duration of that
Yep.
program.
But you also take a look, I want to go back and not necessarily on that point, but if you recall the one with all the bars on, with the groomer versus the powder, you know, we see changes, and we see changes at the hip. Now, we haven't looked at the head, what the upper body is doing, but at the hip and the knee, we see that, but we don't see where there's a steady, constant contraction. We see an on, off, on, off. And we know that if we're skiing and that muscle stays on, you know, why do we see people blowing gaskets after 2 runs in the powder? Because they're constantly contracting their muscles. And that just tears muscles apart. That you can fatigue a muscle so fast that way. But we don't see that. We really don't see where there's that constant pressure. The other thing that happens when people stand up, now you're stacking, you're bone stacking. So it doesn't take a lot of muscle contraction to stand upright, but it takes a lot of muscle contraction to keep like this for the whole turn or the whole run. Does that, I hope that answers
Yeah, just a question. What do you think would have happened with those racers if you had have had them in powder snow? And you had them in powder snow. So you had racers on a slalom ski, or whatever you had them on, and then you had them on a wide ski. And in the gates, they said, I'm more confident on a narrow ski, and they're generally faster on the wider ski. What do you think would have happened if you had to put them in powder?
According to their coach, they spend more time on the groomers than they do in the powder. Even when they say go out with free skiing, directed free skiing, most kids will go out on their wide skis.
Right, but I get that. But from a testing standpoint, if you had tested them in powder,
now we should test them in powder.
Right? Because I mean, to me, this is about having the right tool for the job.
Yep.
I mean, I'm not suggesting anybody should go ski fat skis on groomers. I don't think this is an appropriate tool for the job.
Yeah. But they
But maybe
do.
if his kids were in powder snow, they would have said, you know what, I was more confident, I fell less, and I made nicer turns. Or they thought they did.
But now if you're looking at a developing skier, you look at the motor patterns that take place within a turn, now we see different muscle actions taking place on the different faces of the turn. Now that data was from adults. I can't imagine that our 12, 13, 15, 16, whatever we're dealing with year-old skier is going to be different. I just don't see that. My observation from the young skiers would certainly say, oh, they're just like adults. They come down, they're more parallel to the fall line, they slam their skis, then they come around. Well, what if you do that? I'm only talking about racers now, but what if you do that in a race course? If you have that motor pattern that's established in a young racer, what are they going to do? Even on a narrow ski, they're going to have more of a hook turn where they develop edge pressure or ski pressure at the bottom end of the turn. And that's when you don't want to be producing ski pressure.
So basically, your study says learn to ski in the east and then move west.
Ah, man, you gotta love Vermont. Yeah. You know, it's funny you bring that up because I talk every fall with our ski group at Bridger, the racers and their parents. And they go, well, what can we do to make sure our kids really develop and become good skiers? I say, well, you know you're a good skier if you can ski knee-deep powder in your slalom skis. Think about it. You have to be balanced. You have to be balanced, period. Oh, man, I thought I was going to be run out of town when I said that. You're out to wreck the ski industry. No, just make better skiers.
I'm from Vail, at Ski Historical Club Vail, and
Yeah.
our kids are skiing slalom in powder.
And
We made that switch.
that is the best thing. I know we were there working 2 years ago. I forgot what head coach we were working with, but the with the fifth skiers and the U16. So 15 to 18, 15 to 17-year-old.
They're skiing slalom.
And they knew how to ski. They knew how to ski. No question about that. And I'm starting to see more and more racing programs go that route. Hey, you want to go free ski, fine, but when you're racing with us, you're skiing with us, you're on your race skis or training skis.
Well, they call it directed skiing, but
Directed,
but
yeah.
it is
Mhm.
with drills.
Yep.
And they're doing drills in powder, in moguls, and off piste.
Yeah,
But they're in slaloms.
and that's great to see. I'd love to see that. Because look at body position. You know, skiing is an activity where we're constantly trying to stay in balance. And we can train that. We can change that very easily.
We don't do it as much with the really little kids, but now we have a full-time U10 program, so now we're doing it with U10s.
Yep, that's great
That
to
just
see.
started.
I know Steamboat's starting to go that way.
She goes going the same
Yeah.
way under Deb.
Mhm.
She started with U10.
Yeah, Deb understands it. Yeah, you bet. Okay. Is there a healthy standpoint, kind of move along here? Yeah, we've talked about all these, you know. Anecdotally, you don't know the chronic, the long-term aspect on the knee joint. We don't know. We hear about it. We hear a lot about it. But we do know, depending on ski technique, there is increased stress at the knee joint. Being aware of how skis change technique. You know, lower edge angle, more two-footed skiing. The other thing, the devil really is in the details. We have to keep asking questions. I think that's extremely, extremely important. You know, future work that we have going on, we're looking at alpine touring, tech bindings, you know, be it on the groomer. I found out last year, 2 years ago, at the International Society of Ski Safety, there's no standards for tech bindings. We have standards for alpine, but nothing for tech. Canting, how does canting change our skiing? Dry land exercises, actually I have a master's student who's finishing up this work, looking at what exercises are just basically general overall conditioning exercises, and what exercises really do mimic what we see on the snow.
How long will that be for that?
Next year. She just finished her data collection. Yeah. There we go. I have one other thing. I have to thank Tom for this. It was about 2 years ago, I think. Tom and I go way back. He's a lot older than I am. I think I was probably in junior high when I met him. But we got talking a couple of years ago about progressions. And that's another thing we'd like to look at. What progressions from a mechanical standpoint, physiological standpoint make sense? So we're going to be looking at that. So, you know, Tom put that idea in my head and I can't let it go. I can't leave without thanking, there's so many young people that have helped in this research. I can tell you this group here, 6 young folks, they were my first A team. And you talk about people that laid it down. We have one who's finishing his PhD in neurophysiology. This one being now is a PA, physician's assistant. We have 3 that are physical therapists, and one who's baking muffins down in Crested View. But Shelby here, she was with me for 3 years in the lab. She actually taught her physical therapy section on muscle activity and electromyography. Absolutely incredible young mind. But again, these are all people that have helped in some form or another with our ski projects. Like I said, it's always tough. You know, here some of the people that really have stepped up to the plate for us, helped us out in one form or another. You know, like I said, it's expensive to do this work, and I get the cold sweats thinking about losing sensors in the snow at $2,500 a piece. But they've all chipped in one form or another to help us out. So, thank you.
Last year, or maybe the year before, they brought in certain sensors that people put on their bodies, and then went out and skied with them. Is that something you're doing also? And what are the kind of results are they getting from that?
Yeah, there are these things called IMUs, inertial movement units, and they just hit the market full force. There's some that are good, some that are not. Most that are not are all pretty cheap, pretty inexpensive. They don't collect data fast enough. We collect data for the muscle work, 2,000 collections per second. Yeah. You have to have that. For these IMUs, you're probably looking at anywhere from 500 to 1,000 times per second, depending what you want to look at. A lot on the market, a lot that are inexpensive and that are on the market, they might collect 10 times a second. So yeah, it kind of gets you to look at the stadium, but it doesn't put you in a home plate to bat.
Okay.
Yeah. You certainly get what you pay for. Yes?
Would it be fair to say that the ski manufacturers do not want this research done?
Oh, I've lost some friends. In fact, I just had a discussion with Deb right at noon, Deb Armstrong, and she's going, John, how come this isn't coming out? And I said, well, from the scientific papers, those take a while. These are out, most of them are out, the last couple are not, but they'll be out soon. We've had a lot of pushback from Ski Racing, Ski Magazine, and Powder. And they don't want to touch this. And I'm saying, well, you know, we can discuss and debate. You can't debate facts. You can debate interpretations of the data. We all have interpretations, but you know, we see these things occurring over and over and over again in different studies. You know, look at the knee extension component. There's 3, 4 studies now that have all shown similar results.
Why would, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Why would Powder magazine this supports using.
It does, to me it
Or
does.
powder, why would they not want to publish this?
I've sent it to the editors, I've spoken with editors, I've spoken with their writers, because most aren't in an office, most submit articles from wherever, and they just, boy, we've been after ski racing for a year now, ever since Heidi did the work with the Squaw Valley kids, with the young racers. They won't touch it. They won't touch it. I know 2 of them.
It's got to be their sponsors
Yeah, they're,
would be unhappy,
the advertisers.
the advertisers.
That would not surprise me. Yeah, hey, we're promoting this, mindset, but yet, let's at least get it out there.
Well, to me, the whole thing is, the growth of the fat skis is not so much for the ski racer, it hasn't been.
No.
It's for the pike and park. Because the younger generation is not going out there wanting to ski gates.
No,
They're going out there wanting to catch air. So I would assume that more of the landings that they're doing is creating more harm to their knees than actually the lift of the ski.
yeah, it's a combination, is what I would debate. Simply for the fact that, well, if you're in the park, are you really making turns?
They don't.
No.
They just go from one air.
Yeah, they
feature
go
to the next.
from 15 feet to 15 feet, or 100 feet to 100 feet.
But park skis aren't necessarily that fat. I mean,
No, in fact, they're mids.
Yeah.
Most of those
Yeah,
parks are
They're
80.
very cambered,
Yeah.
Right,
especially
Yeah.
the old park.
and they're not slopping, they're not really rides,
Mhm.
they're.
Oh,
How
yeah.
does this data translate to the telemark community?
Ooh.
Have you even thought about that?
Yep. Oh, you want that? Well, you take a look at it, and it changes because now your pivot point is at your toe. The other thing, I can tell you that we do have partial data on a telemark skier from the US telemark team. But he finished his degree and wanted to get out before he finished the project. The other factor is we are looking at alpine touring. I know it's not the same as telemark per se, but yet we're starting to venture into these other components of skiing. If I were to just take a wild guess and hypothesize what would happen with the telemark skier, I would expect to see somewhat similar results as alpine, but not to the degree that we see with alpine. Okay, because it's easy. Once your heel is elevated, all right, now what do? You can tip a little bit. I still don't believe you would reach the same edge angles with the wide ski as with the narrow ski, even on a telemark ski, but I'd say, just guessing, that the torques would be less, just because now you have one pivot point.
In my experience, telemark is easier on my knees than alpine is.
I
After 50
can
years
see
of
that.
alpine.
I would see that. Hey, I hope to continue questions and answers wherever we are. I think that's one of the big things. I tell my students, grad students all the time, don't be afraid to ask. Think and challenge. Think and challenge, because that's important for us. It's important from a lot of different perspectives. And if we don't ask, then things happen that we may not like. So, thank you for your time.
Thanks, John.